Mrs. Alma Johnson, a seemingly ordinary elderly woman, became the spark of a miraculous journey that moved the entire world. On what seemed like just another flight, she faced indifference and disdainful gazes. Yet, no one could have imagined that Alma, with her heart full of love, would ignite a global movement that awakened millions of hearts. What truly happened on that fateful flight? And how could a humble individual inspire such a profound shift in the world's perception of kindness? Don't miss this incredible story, because within each of us lies the power to turn small acts into miracles. Subscribe to our channel to spread positivity and uncover the extraordinary impact of kindness. Montgomery, Alabama, early spring morning. Soft sunlight filtered through the windows of the modest house where Mrs. Alma Johnson, 80 years old, had lived for over half a century. This home, her sanctuary, held the echoes of an entire lifetime, from the family photos lining the living room walls to the worn armchair, bathed in the golden hues of dawn. A black and white photograph, centered prominently on the wall, commanded attention. Alma in her youth, standing before a classroom with eyes full of conviction. Behind her, neatly seated children of color gazed forward, their faces alight with hope, a hope she had nurtured like a fragile flame. Beside it hung another photo, its colors faded with time, capturing the day her son, Anthony Rivers, graduated from college. Alma, wearing a dress she had painstakingly repurposed from old fabric, stood proudly by his side. Anthony's smile mirrored the radiance in her eyes, a testament to the silent sacrifices of a single mother. In the quiet room, Alma's old suitcase lay neatly packed, resting on the familiar armchair. She opened it gently, pulling out a delicate silk scarf, a gift she had lovingly embroidered for her granddaughter, now studying in Paris. Each stitch carried a story, the Alabama wildflowers of her youth, a river winding its way like the trials of her life. Her trembling hands smoothed the fabric, their touch tender despite the marks of a lifetime of toil. "It's been so long since I've gone anywhere," Alma murmured to herself, her voice carrying both a tremor of apprehension and a flicker of excitement. "I hope I won't be a burden to the kids." Memories swept over her like a tide. The day her husband didn't return from the steel mill, the nights she worked extra shifts to raise Anthony, her calloused hands and sleepless nights by the dim glow of an oil lamp had shaped the boy who grew up to be a successful CEO. Yet in her heart, he remained the eager child who once beamed with pride as he showed her the first math problem he'd solved. That morning, Alma triple-checked her plane ticket and passport, as if the act might anchor her nerves. Standing at the threshold, she paused, her gaze sweeping over the home that had borne witness to laughter, tears, and dreams too big to be contained within its modest walls. "I'll come back," she whispered with a gentle smile. Locking the door behind her, she pulled the well-worn suitcase along the oak-lined path. Each step carried the weight of a lifetime's hope and an unshakable resolve to carry forward the legacy of love she had built. Mrs. Alma Johnson stood quietly amidst the rush of bustling travelers, feeling both small and lost in the lively, unfamiliar scene. The airport's loudspeakers blared announcements in a monotone yet hurried voice, repeating flight information over and over. The clatter of suitcase wheels on tiled floors and the hurried footsteps created a chaotic symphony of modernity that only deepened her unease. Alma glanced down at her old bag, her trembling hands fumbling as she searched for her plane ticket. The fragile, slightly crumpled piece of paper, worn from being checked too many times, felt as though it might lose its significance if it wasn't in the right place. For the third time in just 5 minutes, she pulled out her passport and ticket, her eyes scanning the details carefully, seeking reassurance that everything was still in order. She stood there, surrounded by the brightness and urgency of the airport, weighed down by an oppressive sense of unease that clung to her like a heavy cloak. With a sigh, Alma reminded herself, "I can't mess this up." Her gaze drifted to the silk scarf neatly tucked in her bag, a gift she had spent months embroidering for her granddaughter. It wasn't just a token of affection, it was a symbol of love, sacrifice, and the dreams Alma herself had never been able to chase. The memory of her granddaughter's radiant smile during their last video call floated back to her, offering a small measure of comfort.
"Grandma, I can't wait for you to come,"
the girl had said, her voice brimming with excitement. That beaming face, filled with light and hope, had become Alma's guiding star, urging her to step out of her comfort zone and embark on the longest journey of her life. However, the brief comfort Alma had felt quickly vanished as she began ascending the metal stairs leading into the airplane cabin. The cold steel beneath her feet creaked with each slow step, amplifying her anxiety. She couldn't shake the feeling that every pair of eyes behind her was fixed on her, scrutinizing, impatient, and perhaps even annoyed.
"Can she go any faster?"
A young male voice muttered. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for Alma to hear. She didn't turn around, but a sharp pang struck her heart. Her hand gripped the railing tighter, her fingers trembling.
"I have to move faster."
She urged herself, trying to steady her breathing. Yet the sighs and shifting from those waiting behind her only heightened her sense of suffocation.
"They should let old people board first."
Another voice chimed in, followed by a low chuckle, a mocking edge woven into the laughter. The words were like tiny daggers, piercing her fragile sense of dignity. Alma paused briefly, gripping the handrail as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her back hunched slightly, as though trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. Her breath quickened, and her eyes fixed on the ground, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze.
"It'll be okay,"
she whispered to herself, though the reassurance felt hollow against the rising tide of unease. As she finally reached the cabin door, Alma was greeted by Laura Spencer, a young flight attendant whose air of confidence seemed almost rehearsed. Her uniform was impeccably pressed, her neat cap perched atop a flawless bun. But her eyes were as cold as steel, and the faint smile on her lips barely masked an undercurrent of impatience. Alma gave a small, trembling nod of acknowledgement and tried to smile, though the effort felt shaky and forced. Laura's gaze swept over her, assessing her like an inconvenience rather than a person.
"Hello, do you need something?"
Laura's voice carried no warmth, just a detached reminder that Alma was taking up time.
I need to stow my bag,"
Alma said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she feared her request was too much. Her eyes shifted to the overhead compartment, far out of her reach. The small suitcase in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Laura remained motionless, making no effort to help.
"Other passengers are waiting,"
she said stiffly, her tone matter of fact, as though Alma were simply an obstacle to be dealt with.
"I'll get someone to assist you."
Left with no other option, Alma attempted to lift the suitcase herself. Her frail hands trembled as she gripped the handle, pouring every ounce of strength she had into the effort. Inch by inch, she hoisted it upward, fighting against both the weight of the bag and the crushing pressure of the stairs behind her. But the strain was too much. The suitcase slipped from her grasp and hit the floor with a loud thud that echoed through the cabin. The sound cut through the low hum of the plane, silencing the murmurs and drawing every gaze toward her. Some looked startled, others visibly annoyed, and a few wore expressions of outright disapproval.
"Watch what you're doing,"
an irritated woman near the front exclaimed, her tone sharp and scolding. The words struck Alma like a bell tolling her inadequacy, leaving her feeling smaller than ever. A middle-aged man nearby rose from his seat, gently picking up the suitcase and placing it in the compartment above.
"It's all right, I've got it,"
he said, offering a polite smile. But his eyes, though kind, carried a faint glimmer of pity.
"Thank you,"
Alma murmured, her voice so quiet it was almost inaudible. Her face burned with shame as she bowed her head, clutching her handbag tightly, as if it could anchor her fraying composure. Laura Spencer remained stationary, her lips curling into a slight, almost imperceptible smirk, as though Alma's struggle had been a minor spectacle for her amusement.
I need to attend to the other passengers?
Laura said curtly, turning away without so much as an apology for Alma's ordeal. Her indifference stung, leaving Alma with the distinct impression that, to Laura, she was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The flight attendant's cold dismissal carved itself into Alma's mind, turning her discomfort into a swelling wave of humiliation. Yet Alma said nothing, her silence a shield against further judgment. She shuffled to her seat, each step heavier than the last, burdened by an invisible weight. Seated at last, Alma's trembling hands clung to her handbag, her fingers brushing against the silk scarf inside a fragile reminder of her purpose. Behind her, the murmurs began again, quiet yet cutting.
So troublesome. She couldn't even lift her own bag. How'd she think she could manage without dropping it?
Each whispered remark was like a blade, slicing into Alma's fragile self-esteem and leaving invisible scars. She forced a smile, but it was thin and brittle, a veil stretched over the storm raging within her.
I've caused them trouble,
she thought, her chest tightening. Memories from her younger days surged forth when she had stood before a classroom in Montgomery, Alabama, teaching under the weight of judgmental stares. Back then, she had learned to work harder, to push herself further, just to earn the slightest acknowledgement. Now, decades later, she wondered,
does it ever stop?
Turning her gaze to the window, Alma's vision blurred with unshed tears. The clouds outside drifted past, a stark reminder of the journey still ahead. Somewhere beyond them, her beloved granddaughter was waiting.
It's all right. I can do this,
Alma whispered, trying to push back the sadness swelling inside her. But no matter how hard she tried, the flight attendant's icy stare and the murmurs of disdain lingered, clinging to her like shadows she couldn't shake. Alma moved slowly toward her seat, willing her legs not to tremble. She clutched the handbag holding the silk scarf tightly against her chest, as if it were the only thing preserving a shred of dignity after the cold stares and whispered judgments. Each step felt heavy, as though she carried an invisible burden that grew with every passing moment. Her eyes scanned the numbers on the crumpled ticket in her hand, searching for her seat. The dim cabin lighting offered a soft glow, but it wasn't enough to soothe the suffocating unease settling in her chest. Finally, she spotted her seat, a window position. Alma breathed a quiet sigh of relief. At least she could look outside and avoid the piercing gazes that seemed to follow her. As she sat down, the cold leather of the seat pressed against her, a stark reminder of her discomfort. Her hands gripped the handbag tighter, her palms damp with sweat. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't let go. That small bag now held more than a gift for her granddaughter. It had become her shield against the invisible judgments surrounding her. Yet the whispers behind her persisted, slicing through the cabin's stillness and striking at her fragile composure.
So troublesome. She couldn't even put her suitcase up. How'd she expect to manage without dropping it?
The words weren't loud, but they were sharp, and Alma heard every one. Each remark was like a knife, cutting deep into her heart. She didn't dare turn around, didn't dare face the eyes that accompanied those voices. But their echoes lingered, bouncing endlessly inside her mind. She lowered her head, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace, a desperate attempt to reassure herself. The smile wavered, thin and fragile, much like her spirits in that moment. Her lips quivered, her aging eyes betraying a flicker of helplessness.
I have inconvenienced them,
she thought, her chest tightening as if a rope had been pulled taut around her heart. Turning to the window, Alma sought refuge in the view outside, hoping to escape the murmurs. Through the thick glass, she saw white clouds drifting lazily across the sky like a serene river in the infinite expanse. She focused on the scene, reminding herself of the purpose of her journey, the trip she had waited so long for, the journey that would bring her closer to her beloved granddaughter.
It's all right.
She whispered to herself, the words barely audible, dissolving into the air. But the weight in her heart remained, as though the taunting words and disdainful glances clung to her like chains, refusing to let her go. Closing her eyes, Alma tried to banish the negative thoughts crowding her mind. The image of her granddaughter came to her, vivid and bright, a smiling face with sparkling eyes, her voice echoing from their last video call.
Grandma, I can't wait for you to come. Yes, I must go. I can't let her down.
Alma resolved, clutching her handbag tighter as though it carried all her hopes. But as she sat there, memories of her past crept in unbidden, playing like an old film reel in slow motion. She thought of her younger years, raising her son alone in their small home in Montgomery. Back then, she had grown accustomed to cold stares and sharp words from those who doubted her resolve, doubted her belief in the power of education, doubted that her son could rise above the limitations society placed on people of color. Those same stares, those same words, they weren't so different from what she faced today. The only difference was the passage of time, which had merely layered the same prejudices with new veneers.
Does it ever end?
She wondered, a wave of sadness swelling within her. But then her gaze fell on the handbag in her lap, and she thought of the silk scarf inside. It was more than a gift, it was a testament to her love, her sacrifices, and her hope. She reminded herself that she couldn't afford to falter, not now, not after everything she had endured. This wasn't the first challenge she had faced, and it wouldn't be the last. Outside the window, the white clouds continued their steady drift, a quiet reminder that the journey was far from over. Somewhere ahead, her granddaughter was waiting for her with open arms and a radiant smile. Alma drew a deep breath, forcing herself to focus on that thought, on the good that lay ahead.
It's all right. I can do this.
She told herself, her inner voice carrying a hint of renewed strength. But no matter how hard she tried, the cold, judgmental gaze of Laura Spencer and the hushed, scornful whispers of the other passengers clung to her, a shadow she couldn't shake. Alma knew, deep down, that this was more than just a flight. It was a battle, a test, and above all, a journey to prove to herself that she still had the strength to face whatever came her way. The first minutes of the flight passed in a heavy silence, weighted down by Alma's effort to shrink into herself, desperate to avoid causing any further trouble. But just as she was resigning herself to the solitude of her thoughts, a gentle voice beside her broke through the oppressive quiet. It belonged to Mei Ling, a young passenger with a warm smile that seemed to bring a faint glow into the tense atmosphere. In that moment, a tiny flicker of hope began to surface within Alma, softening the wounds she had just endured. Inside the airplane cabin, the steady hum of the engines droned like a distant rhythm, but to Alma, it sounded more like an echo of loneliness.
Let me help you with that bag, ma'am.
She sat motionless by the window, her hands still clutching the handbag holding the silk scarf. The light streaming through the glass cast a pale glow on her weathered hands, highlighting the calluses etched into her skin by a lifetime of hard work. She no longer looked outside. Alma felt as though unseen eyes still lingered on her, their judgment a silent weight pressing down on her. The accusing whispers from earlier seemed to hover in the air, replaying relentlessly in her mind. Bowing her head, she tried to make herself smaller, as if shrinking into the background could somehow dispel the suffocating tension around her. Then, unexpectedly, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts.
I noticed you've been holding onto that bag so tightly.
Alma lifted her head and met the gaze of a young woman with long black hair tied neatly back. Her face radiated kindness, a stark contrast to the cold, detached stares Alma had faced earlier. There was a genuine warmth in the woman's eyes, a kind of concern that Alma hadn't expected to find here.
It must be something very special to you, isn't it?
Mei Ling said, tilting her head slightly as she smiled.
Yes.
Alma hesitated, caught off guard by the kindness. but then a faint smile broke across her face, the first since she'd boarded the plane.
It's a gift for my granddaughter in Paris. She's a very special girl,
she said softly, her voice trembling just a bit.
Paris? I'm on my way there too. Tell me more about your granddaughter.
Mei Ling leaned forward, resting her hand on the back of her seat, as if to give Alma her full attention. She said, her tone curious yet gentle. Those words, so simple yet heartfelt, felt like a breeze clearing the fog in Alma's heart. Warmth began to seep into the cold spaces that had gripped her since the start of the journey. For the first time, Alma allowed herself to exhale the tension she had been holding, her words flowing more easily now as she spoke of her granddaughter. In that brief exchange, Alma felt a new sense of comfort, an unexpected reprieve from the isolation she had carried with her. And so, in the dim cabin light, a glimmer of hope began to shine, a quiet assurance that even in the most unlikely of places, solace could be found. Mrs. Alma sat quietly in her seat, the oppressive feeling of earlier still clinging to her. Above her, the small suitcase perched awkwardly on the luggage rack, a constant reminder of her clumsiness when she had struggled to place it there.
Would you like me to adjust your suitcase? It looks like it might fall.
A gentle voice spoke from beside her. Startled, Alma looked up, her eyes meeting the warm, kind smile of a young woman. Mei Ling, petite yet quick and capable, rose to her feet before Alma could respond. In a matter of seconds, she had carefully adjusted the suitcase, making sure it was secured properly.
There, that's safer now. You don't need to worry anymore,
Mei Ling said, sitting back down with a radiant smile that seemed to brighten the air around them. Alma returned the smile, small but sincere, though tinged with hesitation.
Thank you, dear. That's very kind of you. People like me, old and a little helpless, we often just make things more difficult.
When Mei Ling appeared with her friendly demeanor and thoughtful offer, the heavy atmosphere surrounding Alma seemed to lift, even if only a little. That simple act of kindness, so unassuming, opened a small door in Alma's heart, a chance to feel warmth amid unfamiliar faces. Their conversation began with brief remarks about luggage, but soon evolved into something deeper. Alma found herself sharing the story of her granddaughter and the silk scarf she carried. Each word, each memory shared, seemed to ease the burden she had been carrying for the entire journey.
Oh no, Mrs. Alma,
Mei Ling said immediately, shaking her head with conviction.
Everyone needs help sometimes, but I can see you're worried about something. Is this trip very important to you?
The question, so simple yet spoken with heartfelt sincerity, unlocked something within Alma. She nodded gently, her eyes dropping to the handbag resting on her lap.
I'm on my way to Paris,
she began softly, her voice warmer now.
My granddaughter is studying there, at university. This is my first time flying, and the first time I'll see her since she left home. She's my pride and joy, a smart, brave young woman.
Mrs. Alma sat quietly in her seat, the oppressive tension from earlier still weighing heavily on her. Above her, the small suitcase perched precariously on the luggage rack, a constant, silent reminder of her earlier struggle to stow it away.
Would you like me to straighten your suitcase? It looks like it might fall.
A gentle voice offered beside her. Startled, Alma lifted her gaze and met the warm smile of a young woman. Mei Ling, petite yet swift and capable, stood up before Alma could respond. In mere seconds, she had adjusted the suitcase with care, securing it firmly in its place.
There, that's better now. You don't have to worry anymore,
Mei Ling said, sitting back down with a smile that seemed to brighten the air around them. Alma managed a faint smile in return, one touched with gratitude but still tinged with hesitation.
Thank you, dear. That's so kind of you. Sometimes people like me, older and a bit clumsy, just end up causing more trouble than help.
Mei Ling's presence, with her friendly demeanor and small act of kindness, seemed to dissolve some of the heaviness that had surrounded Alma since the beginning of the flight. That simple gesture, so unassuming yet profound, opened a door for Alma to feel warmth amid a sea of unfamiliar faces. Their conversation began with light remarks about the suitcase, but soon deepened. Alma, cautiously at first, began to share the story of her granddaughter and the silk scarf she carried. Each word she spoke felt like she was slowly unburdening herself of the worries that had accompanied her on this journey.
"Oh no, Mrs. Alma,"
Mei Ling said immediately, shaking her head firmly.
"Everyone needs help sometimes. But it seems like this trip is especially meaningful to you. Am I?"
The question, simple but spoken with genuine care, unlocked something within Alma. She nodded, her gaze falling to the handbag resting on her lap.
"I'm on my way to Paris."
She began, her voice soft but carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before.
"My granddaughter is studying there, at university. This is my first time flying, and the first time I'll see her since she left home. She's my pride and joy, a smart, brave young woman."
Mei Ling listened intently, her eyes never wavering from Alma's face.
"She must be extraordinary. I'm sure someone like you has passed down so much wisdom and goodness to her."
A faint smile spread across Alma's lips, a mixture of pride and affection.
"She's always dreamed of seeing the world, and now she's living that dream. I just wanted to bring her a small gift, something to remind her that no matter where she goes, her home is always with her. Is the gift in your bag?"
Mei Ling asked, gesturing toward the handbag Alma clutched so tightly. Alma nodded, her fingers gently brushing over the bag, her eyes softening.
"Yes. It's a silk scarf I embroidered myself. Each stitch is a wish, a reminder that no matter where she goes, love and home will always follow her."
Mei Ling leaned back in her seat, her eyes glimmering.
"That's beautiful. I'm sure your granddaughter will treasure it."
Then, after a brief pause, she added,
"I'm on my way to Paris too. I hope to study art and finally pursue my dream." "What's your dream?"
Alma asked, her curiosity now fully engaged, her voice carrying genuine interest.
"I want to open a small gallery."
Mei Ling said, her smile soft but determined.
"A place where people can see the beauty of life in the simple things. My parents don't fully approve. They want me to study business, but I believe I can balance both."
Alma nodded knowingly, her smile deepening with sincerity.
"Dreams are precious. Someone young like you must have the courage to follow them. Don't let anyone hold you back."
Their conversation continued, Mei Ling's words like a soothing breeze easing the heaviness in Alma's heart. For the first time since she had boarded the plane, Alma felt a connection that made her feel less alone. As Alma spoke of her granddaughter, she found herself revisiting her own youth, recalling dreams she had once held but could never pursue. Now, through her granddaughter, she saw those dreams living on. In Mei Ling's youthful energy and determination, Alma saw a reflection of herself from years past. Though strangers, an invisible bond had formed between them, offering Alma a comfort she hadn't dared hope for on this journey. The clouds outside the window drifted lazily by, their endless softness in stark contrast to the earlier harshness she had endured. But within Alma's heart, a light had begun to shine, a faint, growing hope dispelling the shadows she had carried with her since the start of her journey. The conviction in Mei Ling's words did more than unsettle Laura, it stirred the attention of other passengers, some even voicing their agreement. For Alma, Mei Ling's courage felt like a shield, protecting her from the judgmental gazes and thoughtless remarks that had plagued her journey. As the tension subsided, Alma leaned back in her seat, feeling her heartbeat slowly return to a steadier rhythm. The air inside the cabin no longer felt stifling, and she realized that, thanks to Mei Ling and the other passengers, the silence was no longer isolating but a space where she could finally take a deeper breath. Turning her head, she glanced at Mei Ling, who was now engrossed in a small book, but occasionally glanced her way, her friendly expression a quiet reassurance that Alma was not alone. Alma smiled, a real, genuine smile, this time soft yet filled with deep gratitude.
"Thank you.
she said gently, her voice quiet but firm enough to convey the depth of her appreciation. Mei Ling's kindness had done more for Alma than she could ever express. Mei Ling looked up, her warm smile meeting Alma's.
"We're all traveling companions, Mrs. Alma. This isn't just a flight, is it?"
Alma nodded slightly. Mei Ling couldn't know how much those simple words planted a small yet steady light in her heart, not just faith in the kindness of strangers, but hope that this journey might mark the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Still, somewhere deep inside Alma, the tension with Laura lingered, like an unhealed wound. Laura had not returned, but the memory of her cold gaze and dismissive words hung in the air, casting a shadow over what should have been a brighter moment. Alma turned to the window, watching as the white clouds drifted lazily by, dividing the sky into overlapping patches of light and shadow, much like her emotions. One part of her was lifted by the kindness she had just experienced, while another remained weighed down by the indifference and lack of respect she had faced earlier.
"It's all right,"
she whispered to herself, her hands gently stroking the bag in her lap.
"Focus on the good, and everything will be okay."
She didn't know why, but somewhere deep down, she felt that the tension wasn't over. It was like a faint ember, quietly smoldering, waiting for the right moment to flare up again. Yet, even as Alma prepared herself for whatever might come next, she made a quiet promise to herself no matter what, she would not back down this time. Ahead, at her destination, was her beloved granddaughter, the beacon of love and hope that had guided her this far. And now, because of people like Mei Ling, Alma began to believe that she could endure anything to reach what mattered most in her life. As the tension slowly eased, Alma came to a quiet realization. Though this journey had been riddled with challenges, there were people like Mei Ling willing to stand up and shine as beacons of hope. It was these small, fleeting moments that softened the wound she carried, even if the strain with Laura hadn't entirely faded. That unease lingered in the background, subdued for now but poised to resurface at any moment. Mrs. Alma gazed out the window in silence, watching the soft movement of the plane gliding through the boundless sky. A new chapter of her journey had begun, and though obstacles surely lay ahead, she felt a newfound conviction. For the first time in a long while, she believed she would not face them alone. Inside the airplane cabin, the soft light from the overhead panels cast a muted glow, creating an atmosphere of artificial calm. The steady hum of the engines was a constant reminder that the flight was still in progress, but to Mrs. Alma, each passing minute felt endless. She sat by the window, her gaze fixed outside, deliberately avoiding the eyes of those around her. Her hands gently caressed the handbag resting on her lap, seeking solace in the familiarity of the worn leather. Ahead of her, Laura Spencer moved briskly up and down the aisle, the sharp click of her high heels echoing with a cold precision. The flight attendant's indifference hadn't diminished following her confrontation with Mei Ling. If anything, it had only hardened. Laura's gaze occasionally flitted toward Alma, carrying a silent, pointed disapproval. A faint smile played on Laura's lips, but it wasn't warm, it was tinged with mockery. As Laura stopped by a nearby passenger, she leaned in with a flawless expression of cheerfulness, her voice polished with practiced politeness.
"Is there anything else I can get for you?"
she asked, exuding care and attentiveness. But as she passed Alma, she glanced at her with the barest acknowledgement, her eyes brushing over her as though she were invisible. Alma felt the sting of it. Every glance, every gesture from Laura seemed to underline the same unspoken message: she was unwelcome on this flight. Yet Alma kept her silence, her fingers gripping her handbag a little tighter, as though the act of holding on could shield her from the sharp edges of isolation. The cabin grew stifling, not with noise, but with the quiet tension simmering between Alma and Laura. Most of the other passengers had returned to their books, their screens, or their sleep, oblivious to the invisible storm that raged in Alma's corner of the plane. But for Alma, the unease lingered, like a smoldering ember waiting for the smallest spark to ignite into a consuming flame. Alma gently pressed the call button on the armrest, her frail fingers trembling slightly as the small light above her seat flickered on. Unease settled in her chest like an unwelcome guest. She had tried to avoid drawing attention, tried not to be a bother, but now she truly needed help. Her water bottle was empty, and her throat felt parched from the cold, dry air of the cabin. A moment later, Laura Spencer appeared at the far end of the aisle. But instead of heading directly to Alma's seat, Laura glanced at the illuminated call light, her brows knitting together in faint irritation before veering toward another passenger nearby.
"Would you like more coffee, sir?"
Laura asked, her voice syrupy sweet, almost to the point of insincerity. The middle-aged man smiled and nodded, and Laura quickly reached for a coffee cup from the cart. She chatted with him for a few seconds, exchanging pleasantries, her tone warm and engaging, before moving on to yet another passenger. Alma remained patient, telling herself that perhaps Laura was simply busy. But as Laura passed by her seat, Alma looked up with a soft smile and gently reminded her.
"May I have some more water, please?"
Laura paused for a split second, her eyes flickering over Alma, as if she were a ghostly blur rather than a person.
"I'll get to you in a moment,"
she said curtly, her tone devoid of the courtesy she had shown the others. But Laura did not return. Instead, she continued down the aisle, stopping to assist a woman holding an infant, her radiant smile reappearing as she cooed at the baby. Alma watched quietly, a wave of helplessness and hurt washing over her. At the rear of the cabin, Laura stood chatting with another flight attendant, a blonde woman with her hair neatly pinned into a bun. Leaning in close, Laura whispered something, her eyes darting toward Alma. Her colleague stifled a laugh, the sound barely audible but unmistakable. Sitting nearby, Alma could sense, with a sinking certainty, that she was the subject of their amusement. Alma lowered her head, her hands instinctively clutching the silk scarf in her lap, as though it might provide some comfort. A dull ache bloomed in her chest, a familiar sting she had endured throughout her life, the sting of being dismissed, overlooked, treated as though she were unworthy of even the most basic respect. She tried to take a deep breath, but it came in short, ragged gasps. I must have been a nuisance, she thought, her eyes fixed on the airplane floor. But a small voice deep inside her pushed back against the guilt. Why should I endure this? Is it because I'm old? Because I'm no longer quick or strong? Outside the window, the clouds drifted by in a serene, unbroken sea of white. But inside Alma's heart, those clouds were shadowed by sadness and the ache of being made to feel invisible. Alma felt a tightening in her chest, each breath growing heavier and more labored. She brought a trembling hand to her chest, trying to inhale deeply, but the air in the cabin felt stifling, as though it were suffocating her. The low hum of the engines around her became an oppressive soundtrack, pressing down on her mind. Leaning forward slightly, Alma gripped the armrests of her seat, searching for balance. Her throat was dry and her head spun. I need water. I need help, she thought, but her inner voice was drowned out by a rising wave of panic. With a shaky hand, she pressed the call button once more, the small overhead light blinking on like a silent plea for rescue. The seconds stretched endlessly, and no one came. Laura Spencer, stationed near the back of the cabin, noticed the light. She frowned, leaning toward a colleague to mutter under her breath.
"It's her again."
Her voice was low, but just loud enough to make the other flight attendant chuckle, a sharp, quiet laugh tinged with shared disdain. Instead of responding promptly, Laura took her time adjusting her scarf, her steps languid and indifferent as she finally made her way down the aisle. When she reached Alma's seat, she stopped, arms crossed over her chest, her gaze sweeping over the elderly woman like a dispassionate searchlight.
"What do you need?"
Laura asked, her tone devoid of concern or urgency. Alma struggled to lift her head, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps.
I'm not feeling well. I need water, or someone to help me."
She stammered, her voice weak and faltering. Laura sighed audibly, her impatience plain for all to see.
"I'll see if I can find some water,"
she said curtly. But instead of rushing to assist, she turned and walked back toward the front of the cabin, her pace slow, leaving Alma suspended in a limbo of waiting and fear. Nearby passengers began to notice. A middle-aged woman seated across the aisle frowned deeply, her worry unmistakable.
"She doesn't look well,"
she whispered to the person next to her.
"Someone should do something."
A young man sitting 2 rows away pulled out his phone, activating the camera to record. His brow furrowed as he watched Laura's sluggish movements, her apparent indifference sparking a fire of outrage in his eyes.
"She doesn't even care,"
he muttered, his voice low but filled with anger. Mei Ling, seated right next to Alma, quickly grasped the severity of the situation. She placed a steadying hand on Alma's shoulder, leaning in with genuine concern.
"Mrs. Alma, are you okay? Let me get someone to help you."
Mei Ling didn't wait for Laura to return. She stood up, stepping into the aisle with urgency, raising her hand to catch another flight attendant's attention.
"We need assistance here. She's not well."
The tension in the cabin escalated rapidly. More passengers turned their heads, their eyes a mixture of worry and curiosity. Whispers spread like wildfire, punctuated by the occasional murmured complaint about Laura's behavior.
"This is unacceptable,"
the man recording the incident said, his voice rising.
"An elderly woman in distress, and they treat her like this? What the hell are they doing?"
Amid the growing chaos, Alma remained motionless, her hands gripping the armrests as if clinging to a lifeline. She had no strength left to speak, no air to demand the help she needed. Everything around her blurred, the world narrowing to a crushing sense of abandonment, of being left behind in a place she no longer belonged. Outside the window, the endless blue sky stretched wide and serene, but inside the cabin, Alma's world seemed to constrict further, pressing down on her. A single tear slipped down her cheek, not from physical pain, but from the deep wound of being unseen, dismissed, and forgotten. Mei Ling sat back down beside Alma, her hands gently clasping the older woman's trembling fingers.
"Don't worry, Mrs. Alma,"
she said softly, her voice steady and reassuring.
"I'm here. We'll take care of this."
The warmth of Mei Ling's touch and her steadfast presence brought a flicker of gratitude to Alma's weary eyes. She managed a faint nod, but deep inside, an emotional storm churned, ready to burst forth at any moment. Mrs. Alma lowered her head, her vision dimming as her breaths came in short, shallow gasps. The tightness in her chest was not only from the physical struggle to breathe, but from a deeper, more piercing ache, the realization that she, a person with worth and dignity, was being ignored as though she didn't exist. Laura's cold, deliberate indifference felt like a blade, cutting deep and exposing memories Alma had spent a lifetime burying. She was back in the 1950s, a young teacher in Montgomery, Alabama, facing a world where discrimination wasn't just in sneers or sidelong glances, it was an entire system stacked against her and the black children she taught. She remembered the first time she was assigned to a decrepit school, its desks broken, its textbooks hand-me-downs so old they were missing pages. Across the street stood a pristine school for white children, with sprawling playgrounds and immaculate facilities. One morning, as Alma stood before her class, a shy little girl named Daisy raised her hand.
"Miss Alma?"
she asked timidly.
"Why don't we have a playground like the one over there?"
The question left Alma momentarily speechless. She couldn't lie, but neither could she bear to deliver the harsh truth to a child so full of innocence. Instead, she smiled gently and said,
"One day, Daisy, things will be fairer. But for now, let's make the best of what we have."
Her words, though spoken with hope, had left Alma with a hollow ache. How could she explain to these children that the world had already decided they belonged on the outside looking in? Snapping back to the present, Alma felt the old pain return with a flood-like force. The judgmental glances of the passengers on the plane were no different from the stares she'd endured decades earlier, when she dared to step into a whites-only diner in the 1960s. She remembered the humiliation of being refused service, the silent retreat she had to make as mocking eyes followed her out the door. Sitting alone on the steps outside, she had fought back tears, swallowing her pride, telling herself she had to be strong to survive. But now, as Alma looked at Laura, the flight attendant, with her indifferent eyes and dismissive demeanor, she couldn't help but wonder, had any of her endurance meant anything? She had been resilient, had weathered it all, but why did injustice still persist? Her hands tightened around the handbag in her lap, where the silk scarf she had painstakingly embroidered lay folded. That scarf was meant to be a symbol of hope, of love, of her belief that the next generation would not have to face the struggles she had endured. But sitting there, in the oppressive silence of the cabin, Alma couldn't help but ask herself, will my granddaughter face this too? Have my sacrifices been enough to change anything? Tears slipped quietly down Alma's cheeks, and she fought to keep herself from sobbing aloud. Her entire life had been a lesson in silence and endurance, but now that silence felt like an unbearable weight, a burden too heavy to carry. Amid her turmoil, another feeling began to stir within Alma, not resignation, but a faint flicker of defiance. She glanced toward Mei Ling, who was still anxiously calling for help, her voice carrying through the cabin like a beacon. In Mei Ling's determination and compassion, Alma saw a reminder that the world, no matter how cold, still held people willing to stand beside her.
It's going to be okay,
Alma whispered to herself, her voice trembling but resolute.
I've faced worse. I can face this too.
The clouds outside the window drifted steadily, their white softness blending into the endless blue sky. But this time, Alma didn't see them through a lens of sorrow. Instead, they felt like a quiet reminder that everything, no matter how slow, was in motion. Change was possible, even if it was glacial. And for the first time in a long while, Alma allowed herself to believe it. Mrs. Alma sat quietly in her seat, her gaze fixed on the window. But she no longer saw the blue sky or the white clouds drifting lazily by. Instead, her mind was consumed by a crushing emptiness, as if she were adrift in an endless ocean, with no one to reach out and pull her from the depths. Beside her, Mei Ling held Alma's hand firmly, trying to lend her strength.
Mrs. Alma, don't worry. I'll do everything I can to make sure you get the help you need,
Mei Ling said, her voice low but brimming with determination. But Alma couldn't respond. Her head hung low, her trembling hands clutching her handbag as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the present. Silent tears slipped down her weathered cheeks, unstoppable despite her best efforts. A lifetime of enduring in silence had trained her to suppress her emotions, but now that silence felt like a prison, locking her in a cell of pain and helplessness. Up in the aisle, Laura continued with her duties, each step and every word she uttered shadowed by the judgmental stares of the passengers. The murmurs of discontent spread like wildfire through the cabin.
What's wrong with her? It's obvious the elderly woman isn't well. This feels like one of those budget airlines. I'm definitely filing a complaint.
A young man with a phone still recording the scene raised his voice, his frustration spilling over.
She doesn't care at all,
he said, louder this time.
This is completely unacceptable.
Laura could no longer ignore the growing outrage. Her shoulders tensed, but her face remained cold, her expression carefully blank. She quickened her pace, avoiding the eyes of the increasingly dissatisfied passengers. The air inside the cabin felt taut, like a string pulled to its breaking point. The passengers exchanged glances filled with mounting frustration, their whispers growing louder. Yet no one stepped forward to confront Laura directly. And Alma, caught in the storm of emotions swirling around her, felt herself sinking deeper into isolation. I shouldn't have bothered anyone, I shouldn't have boarded this flight, she thought, her heart gripped by guilt and self-recrimination. But deep within, Alma knew this wasn't her fault. What was happening wasn't the result of her actions, but a reflection of a deep-rooted callousness that had been perpetuated across generations, a cycle of injustice she had witnessed too many times in her life. Mei Ling remained steadfast at Alma's side, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and determination. She turned to Alma, her voice soft but resolute.
I promise you, they won't be able to ignore this for much longer.
Alma looked at Mei Ling, and for a brief moment, a faint glimmer of hope flickered in her tear-clouded eyes. Perhaps there were still people willing to stand by her. But for now, the overwhelming feelings of abandonment and helplessness held the upper hand. Outside the window, the white clouds took on an eerie, cold stillness, as if even the sky was silently watching the injustice unfold. Inside the cabin, the tension continued to build. What had begun as a dispute between Laura and Alma had grown into something larger, a silent rebellion against a culture of indifference, a storm of discontent ready to break free. As the murmurs of discontent and the angry stares began to ripple through the airplane cabin, the silence Alma had once resigned herself to was shattered by a growing wave of opposition. Within her, the ache of neglect and the sting of abandonment still smoldered, but for the first time, she felt the collective empathy of those around her. In that fleeting moment, a faint glimmer of hope sparked within her, a fragile but undeniable signal that, perhaps this time, she wouldn't have to face it alone. The atmosphere in the airplane cabin had shifted. The steady hum of the engines could no longer drown out the whispers, the murmurs of discontent, and the growing number of eyes fixed on Laura. Passengers who had once been absorbed in their screens or books were now paying attention. Alma's quiet endurance had transformed into an unspoken wave of unrest, waiting for someone to ignite it. From a nearby row, an elderly man with a tall, lean frame and a weathered jacket, a veteran, rose to his feet. His voice was low but carried the gravity of righteous anger as he looked directly at Laura.
We will not tolerate this kind of disrespect.
For a moment, the cabin seemed to freeze, the only sound Jack's voice resonating through the tense air. Then, as though his words had broken a dam, other passengers began to speak up. A middle-aged woman nearby raised her voice, her tone firm and demanding.
She needs help now, and we need an apology.
A younger man, still recording on his phone, shook his head in visible frustration.
We pay for this service, not to see vulnerable people treated like they don't matter.
Beside Alma, Mei Ling stood as well, stepping forward to join Jack. Her voice was calm but carried a fierce conviction.
This isn't just about one passenger, it's about how we choose to treat each other, and we won't sit silently and let this continue.
Those words, spoken by so many voices, spread like wildfire through the cabin. Near the front, Laura froze mid-step in the aisle. Her face flushed crimson as her gaze darted nervously around, searching for a way to regain control while maintaining an air of composure. But the energy in the cabin had already turned against her. The tension in the air felt like a taut string about to snap. And this time, the passengers refused to remain silent. The tension in the airplane cabin smoldered like an ember, ready to ignite as voices of dissent grew louder among the passengers. Jack stood tall in the aisle, unyielding. He pointed at Laura, his voice low but brimming with authority.
You need to do your job properly,
he said firmly.
An apology and a change in attitude are the bare minimum we demand.
Passengers nodded in agreement. An older woman seated across from Alma added,
None of us will accept how you treated her. This isn't just unprofessional, it's a fundamental lack of respect.
Mei Ling, still standing beside Alma, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering reassurance.
We won't let them dismiss you like this,
she said softly to Alma, though her words were loud enough for Laura to hear. Laura stood frozen, caught under the scorching glares of the passengers around her. her lips pressed into a thin line as she struggled to maintain her composure, but her eyes betrayed a growing discomfort. Her face flushed red and her hands clenched tightly together, as though trying to suppress something simmering beneath the surface. After a long, tense pause, she finally began to move toward Alma, each step deliberate and heavy. Stopping just short of the elderly woman, Laura cast a fleeting, indifferent glance at her. The words she spoke next were meant to be an apology, but her tone lacked even a trace of sincerity.
"Ma'am,"
Laura said, her voice low and dry.
"I'm sorry if I made you feel uncomfortable."
Her words hung in the air, cold and hollow, as lifeless as her expression. No explanation, no sign of genuine remorse. For a moment, the cabin fell silent, only to be broken by murmurs of dissatisfaction rippling through the passengers. Alma lifted her head, her eyes a mix of disbelief and quiet disappointment. A part of her wanted to accept the apology, to let the moment pass and no longer be the center of attention. But another part of her felt the weight of the cold indifference in Laura's voice and gaze, leaving her even more disheartened.
"You don't need to apologize if you don't mean it,"
Alma said softly, her voice carrying an unmistakable undertone of hurt. Her hands tightened around the handbag resting on her lap, as though anchoring herself to her dignity. Mei Ling's hand gently squeezed Alma's shoulder, her gaze unwavering as she turned to face Laura.
"Mrs. Alma, this apology isn't enough,"
Mei said, her voice firm yet calm. She looked directly at Laura, her tone sharpening.
"Change doesn't come from empty words. We expect you to treat her, and all of us, with the respect we deserve."
Jack nodded in agreement.
"An apology should come with action. If you're not willing to do that, we won't stay silent."
Laura stood motionless for a moment, her gaze flickering between Alma and the other passengers. Her face still bore traces of irritation, but at last she spoke again.
"I apologize for not addressing your needs in a timely manner. I will work to improve going forward."
Her words carried a hint of concession, but they still fell short of satisfying the crowd. Even so, the suffocating tension in the cabin began to ease, if only slightly. Alma bowed her head in a small gesture of reluctant acceptance, though her eyes remained clouded with sadness. Despite the support she had received, the sting of Laura's disdain lingered. And while the apology had been spoken, Alma could not forget the coldness in the flight attendant's eyes. Outside the window, the sky stretched endlessly in a serene expanse of blue. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained heavy with unresolved tension, simmering beneath the surface like a wave waiting for its chance to rise again. The air in the airplane cabin felt like a simmering flame, waiting for a strong gust to ignite it into a full-blown blaze. As Laura walked away, her smug smile didn't escape the sharp eyes of the passengers watching her every move. Some turned to whisper amongst themselves, but others didn't stop at words. A young man sitting nearby still held his phone tightly in his hand, his fingers moving deftly across the screen to save the video he had just recorded. In the clip, Laura's dismissive attitude and hollow, perfunctory apology toward Mrs. Alma were clear as day. His lips pressed into a firm line, but the anger in his eyes was impossible to hide.
"I won't let this get swept under the rug,"
he said loudly, as if daring those around him to disagree.
"People like her shouldn't work in customer service. Everyone needs to know."
A middle-aged woman sitting nearby turned around, nodding in agreement.
Posted, "We can't let this kind of indifference continue. If we don't speak up, they'll think they can get away with anything."
Mei Ling, still seated beside Mrs. Alma, nodded as well, her voice soft but firm.
"What she went through isn't just a mistake. It's part of the injustice so many people face. They need to know we won't stand for it."
As the video circulated among the passengers nearby, murmurs of indignation began to spread. An older man sitting a few rows ahead turned around, his expression filled with disappointment.
"I can't believe this happened right in front of us. She deserves respect, not to be ignored."
A young woman sitting beside Jack shook her head, her eyes dark with frustration.
People like Laura tarnish the reputation of the entire industry. This isn't just about Mrs. Alma. It's about all of us.
Those words seemed to be the final push. The young man with the phone pressed the upload button, his expression resolute.
It's done,
he said.
People are going to see this, and the airline will have to take responsibility.
A soft ping sounded as the video began to spread. Other passengers, having received the video, quickly hit the share button.
I tagged the airline,
the young man announced, a hint of satisfaction in his voice.
In a few hours, everyone's going to know about this.
The cabin buzzed with activity as conversations swelled, and no one seemed interested in the entertainment screens or books in their hands anymore. A growing wave of outrage rippled through the space, directed not only at Laura but at the entire system that had enabled such callous behavior. Mei Ling turned to Mrs. Alma, her gaze softening but still resolute.
Mrs. Alma, they won't ignore this,
she said with conviction. Mrs. Alma nodded gently, her weary eyes glistening with tears but not tears of sadness. In that moment she felt the strength of unity from these strangers. While Laura's disdainful gaze still lingered in her heart, she knew she was no longer alone this time. Outside the airplane window, sunlight pierced through the clouds, scattering in glittering rays. But inside the cabin, the real light came from the collective resolve of the passengers, a glimmer of hope that justice, no matter how small, might finally be served. The airplane cabin had settled into an eerie stillness after the fiery tension of earlier moments. The murmurs of protest had subsided, leaving behind a taut atmosphere, like a string pulled to its breaking point, waiting for the slightest jolt to snap. Laura, after reluctantly delivering her apology, retreated to the back of the cabin, attempting to distance herself from the piercing gazes of judgment. Each step she took was weighted, her attempt at a composed demeanor betrayed by the unease etched across her face. A few passengers continued to watch her, their eyes filled with quiet disappointment, as though they expected more not just from her, but from the airline she represented. Elsewhere, the young man with the phone stared intently at his screen. His video was already garnering hundreds of views and shares within minutes. A small, grim smile tugged at his lips, not one of joy, but of grim satisfaction that the injustice they had witnessed wouldn't go unnoticed.
We did the right thing,
he murmured to the woman seated beside him, his voice carrying an air of resolve, as though he were reassuring himself of the same. A middle-aged woman nearby glanced up, her voice gentle yet firm.
Yes, but this is just the beginning. They won't be able to ignore it once everyone sees what happened.
Mei Ling, seated beside Alma, gently squeezed the older woman's hand in a gesture of reassurance.
Everyone here is on your side, Mrs. Alma,
she said softly, her gaze glowing with determination.
And not just on this flight.
Alma didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, her tired eyes gazing out of the window at the boundless expanse of blue sky. Inside her heart, the sting of Laura's disdain lingered, but this time it wasn't the only thing she felt. Interwoven with the pain was a faint glimmer of hope that this time, her story might not be buried like so many times before. Around the cabin, passengers gradually returned to their seats, but none fully disengaged from the events that had unfolded. Some continued to whisper in hushed tones, while others leaned over their screens, sharing the story on social media with captions brimming with outrage. As the plane continued its journey through a tense quiet, another storm was brewing in the outside world. The video, shared and reshared across platforms, gained momentum at an unrelenting pace. Likes, comments, and reposts multiplied, forming a digital tidal wave of anger and demand for accountability. The captions accompanying the posts were powerful.
We can't stay silent about this treatment. This airline needs to answer for its actions. Everyone needs to see this video to understand the injustice that still exists.
The outrage rippled across social media, an unstoppable force akin to a tsunami. gathering speed and strength with every passing moment. Inside the cabin, Alma sat quietly, her hands clutching the small bag that held the embroidered scarf for her granddaughter. But for the first time in a long while, her heart wasn't entirely enveloped by loneliness. She knew, deep down, that her voice had been heard this time, and that perhaps, just perhaps, a small spark of change had been ignited. As the plane began its descent, Alma sat silently by the window, her gaze fixed on the glittering lights below. Her heart was heavy. Despite the passengers rallying to her defense, Laura's disdainful glances and hollow apology lingered in her mind like an unhealed wound. Little did Alma know, while she grappled with her tumultuous emotions, a storm was brewing beyond the confines of the cabin. When the plane's wheels touched the ground, Alma remained unaware that at the arrival gate, her son Anthony Rivers had already learned of the ordeal through social media. Overwhelmed with worry and indignation, Anthony was ready to confront anything and anyone to seek justice for his mother. A much larger reckoning awaited, one that would ensure Alma's suffering would not be forgotten. Alma sat in a wheelchair provided by an airport attendant, her frail hands resting atop her small handbag. Her weary eyes gazed downward, unfocused, as if the energy to lift them had been drained by the tension of the flight. Every breath felt heavy, her body still reeling from the strain of the journey. Clutched tightly within her handbag was the silk scarf, a gift for her granddaughter, a reminder of the resilience that had carried her through an ordeal she wished she could forget. Ahead of her, the bustling airport teemed with hurried travelers, their voices merging into a distant, indistinct hum. For Alma, the cacophony was muffled, a background noise to the weight of her thoughts. She closed her eyes briefly, willing herself to gather strength, but the tension still clung to her like a persistent shadow, refusing to let go. Amid the din, a voice cut through, clear and familiar.
"Mom!"
Alma's eyes opened, and she lifted her head. Before her stood her son, Anthony Rivers, striding toward her with purpose. His crisp suit and polished appearance couldn't conceal the worry etched into his features. He moved swiftly through the crowd, his sharp eyes scanning her for any signs of distress. Anthony knelt before her wheelchair, his hands gently enveloping hers.
"Are you all right, Mom?"
His deep voice trembled slightly, betraying the storm of emotions, concern, anger raging beneath his composed exterior.
"I saw everything online. How could they treat you like this?"
Alma gazed at her son, her tired eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She shook her head slowly, her voice frail as she replied,
"I'm fine. I just need to rest."
But in her heart, she knew that the injustice she had endured couldn't simply be brushed aside with words of reassurance. Anthony tightened his grip on her hands, his resolve hardening. His eyes, once soft with worry, sharpened as they scanned the surroundings, his expression transforming into one of icy determination. He looked every bit the man prepared to face any force that dared to harm the person he cherished most.
"No one has the right to hurt you,"
he said, his voice low but laced with steely conviction.
"I won't let this be forgotten."
For a brief moment, Alma's heart felt lighter, not because the pain had subsided, but because she knew she wasn't alone in facing it. As Anthony stood, his shoulders squared and his presence commanding, Alma saw in him the unyielding defender she had always believed him to be. This time, justice would not be a fleeting notion. It would be pursued, demanded, and achieved. Anthony Rivers strode quickly through the crowded arrivals terminal, his eyes scanning every face with tense urgency. His heart pounded not from exhaustion, but from the storm of worry churning within him. Ever since he'd seen the viral video online, the image of his mother, the woman he revered most, being ignored and mistreated on her flight, had played over and over in his mind, a relentless loop of anguish and fury. When his gaze finally landed on Alma, he froze. There she was, his elderly mother, sitting in a wheelchair, her face pale, her shoulders seeming to shrink beneath an old, worn coat. Her frail hands rested quietly on her handbag, but they trembled slightly, betraying just how weak she had become.
It's weakenation.
Anthony called out, his voice hoarse. Alma lifted her head, her weary eyes lighting up as they met her son's. A faint smile crossed her lips, but it couldn't hide the fragility etched into her features. Anthony rushed to her, dropping to his knees beside the wheelchair.
My God, Mom, what happened?
He asked, his voice trembling as he took her hands in his. The coldness of her fingers sent a pang through his chest.
You don't need to worry,
Alma whispered, her voice barely audible.
I'm fine. The flight was just tiring.
But Anthony couldn't lie to himself. His mother's exhaustion wasn't simply the result of her age or a long journey. It was the depletion of someone who had borne far too much for far too long. His eyes flicked to the wheelchair, a stark testament to his helplessness. Anger ignited within him, burning hot and fierce. He, a man who had built an empire, a leader whose word commanded respect from thousands, now felt powerless in the face of his mother's frailty. A woman who deserved only dignity and care.
What did they do to you?
Anthony asked, his voice dropping dark and heavy. He didn't need her to answer, the video had already revealed the truth. But what he couldn't accept was that he, armed with all the power to shape change, had failed to shield her from harm.
You shouldn't have had to endure that.
Anthony continued, his voice thick with remorse and simmering rage.
They had no right to hurt you. No one has that right.
Alma shook her head gently, her gaze soft but weary.
Anthony, I'm fine. Don't let this trouble you too much.
But Anthony couldn't stop his thoughts from spiraling. He thought of all the hardships she had faced throughout her life. From the time he was a child, he had watched his mother's quiet strength as she confronted prejudice and injustice, standing tall against the inequities of the world. She had taught him resilience and self-respect, sacrificing everything so that he could rise to where he was today. And now, to see her treated this way on the very airline he had built, the one he had once believed could make a difference, was unbearable. In that moment, a profound regret seeped into his soul. He had created a thriving business, but what did that matter if his own mother still suffered the injustices he thought he had eradicated? He said, his voice cracking.
This will never happen again, I promise you.
Alma looked at her son, her eyes softening. She said nothing, only nodded faintly. She understood the pain in Anthony's heart, but she also knew that monumental change required more than just a promise. Anthony gripped her hands tighter, his eyes shining with unshakable determination. Alma was the embodiment of everything good he had ever known, and he would not let anyone harm her again, not now, not ever. The airport terminal quickly became the center of attention. A small corner had been cleared, with microphones and cameras aimed squarely at Anthony Rivers, who stood tall amidst the crowd. The air buzzed with anticipation and tension as reporters, passengers, and airport staff gathered to witness this unexpected press conference. Anthony, dressed in a sharp suit, wore his emotions openly. His eyes, piercing and resolute, revealed a blend of fury and determination. In front of him stood a row of microphones, and behind him were passengers from his mother's flight, including Mei Ling and Jack, standing silently as a quiet show of support. Stepping forward, Anthony's expression was grave but brimming with confidence. When he began to speak, his voice rang out, strong and unyielding, filling the room.
Today,
Anthony began, his gaze sweeping across the crowd.
Our airline failed in its most critical duty, protecting its passengers. And even worse, the person who suffered is the one I respect the most, my mother, Mrs. Alma Rivers.
A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Anthony didn't pause. His voice rose, carrying the righteous anger he had restrained until now.
This isn't just about my mother. This is about everyone who has ever been neglected, disrespected, or ignored. Those without a voice or without anyone to stand up for them. We cannot allow this to continue, and as the leader of this airline, I will not let it happen again.
A bold declaration. Anthony paused for a beat, his fiery gaze meeting the cameras before him. Then, his voice grew even stronger, resonating with an undeniable resolve.
I've watched the footage of how my mother was treated. I've seen the indifference, the lack of accountability from our staff. And right now, I want to publicly apologize to my mother and to every passenger who witnessed that unacceptable behavior.
Turning to Alma, seated in her wheelchair with Mei Ling by her side, Anthony's tone softened. He said, his voice quieter but thick with emotion.
I'm sorry I didn't protect you the way you've protected me my whole life. But I promise you this, what happened to you will never happen again. Not to you and not to anyone else.
Facing the cameras again, Anthony raised his voice.
Laura Spencer, the employee directly responsible for this incident, is being terminated immediately. There is no excuse, no context that can justify such blatant disrespect.
The sound of cameras clicking was deafening, and the crowd had grown completely silent, hanging on Anthony's every word. He continued, his tone now laced with unwavering commitment.
Today our airline failed, but it will never happen again. Starting today, I am pledging to overhaul our entire customer service system, to implement new standards of respect and empathy. I will make sure no passenger ever has to endure what my...
Scattered applause began, hesitant at first, but quickly grew into a wave of enthusiastic support. Mei Ling smiled softly, nodding in agreement. Jack straightened up, clapping with pride. Anthony took a deep breath, his gaze softening as he took in the support around him. But inside, he knew this wasn't an ending, it was the beginning of a long and arduous journey toward change. As he stepped down from the podium, his eyes found his mother's. He knelt beside her, gently taking her hand.
I promise, Mom,
he said quietly, his voice filled with unshakable determination.
We'll make things better, not just for you, but for everyone.
Alma smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. In that moment, she didn't just see her successful son, she saw a man willing to stand for what was right, just as she had done in her youth. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, its light fading but not disappearing entirely. In the airport terminal, the applause continued, a reminder that change, no matter how slow, could begin in the smallest of places with one determined heart refusing to back down. Anthony strode slowly out of the press conference area, the applause and camera flashes behind him fading into silence. Yet within him, a cacophony of haunting echoes refused to relent. The cold, detached voice of Laura from the video, the sorrowful gaze of his mother as she sat quietly in her wheelchair. These images clung to his mind like a somber refrain, replaying relentlessly, each repetition a reminder of his failure. His hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white from the force. Rage burned inside him, an uncontrollable fire searching for release. He couldn't reconcile how the very airline he had painstakingly built, an enterprise he had once prided himself on for delivering comfort and respect, had become the setting for such dehumanizing treatment of his own mother, the woman he revered above all others. Anthony glanced down at his hands that had signed countless contracts, shaken hands with some of the most influential people in the world. Now they trembled with helplessness. What have I truly accomplished? He questioned himself. I've built an empire, but what does it matter if my mother, the woman who sacrificed everything for me, was still treated like a burden? The image of Alma, her head bowed, her weary eyes accepting Laura's hollow apology, played over and over in his mind. His jaw tightened, his chest tightening with a mix of fury and profound frustration, not just at Laura, but at the entire system that allowed such disrespect to thrive. But as the anger boiled, another emotion surfaced, more piercing and unbearable: regret. Anthony drew in a sharp breath, the weight of all the injustices his mother had endured pressing heavily on his chest. Memories of his childhood flooded back. He saw Alma tirelessly working, braving the scornful looks of those around her, just to provide for him. He heard her words late at night, her voice weary but unwavering with hope.
Anthony, I don't need anything for myself. I just want you to have the chance to live a better life.
She had always placed him above all else, sacrificing everything so he could rise. And now, even as he stood at the pinnacle of power and prestige, he had failed to do the same for her. I can change the world, he thought bitterly, yet I couldn't even protect the most important person in it. He ran a hand over his face, his gaze drifting out to the runways stretching into the horizon, bathed in the glow of the setting sun. Anthony realized, in that moment, that all his influence and status meant nothing if they couldn't bring justice to the woman who had taught him the meaning of dignity and principle. A deep resolve stirred within him. This wasn't just about avenging his mother, it was about righting a systemic wrong. Her words from before the press conference echoed in his mind.
It's not just me, Anthony. There are so many others like me, people without a voice.
Anthony took a long, steadying breath, his eyes now reflecting a fierce determination. The rage within him wouldn't be wasted, it would be harnessed, transformed into action and meaningful change. He couldn't rewrite the past, but he could wield his power to forge a different future, a future where people like his mother would never again be dismissed or disrespected. Turning toward the terminal, Anthony's eyes fell on Alma, who waited for him in the lounge. She sat quietly in her wheelchair, her weary face softened by a faint glimmer of hope. He approached her, an unspoken vow forming in his heart. "Mom, I won't let what you endured be in vain. From this moment on, everything changes." No matter how arduous the path ahead might be, Anthony knew he wouldn't stop until that promise was fulfilled. Anthony strode through the airport terminal, each step heavy with the weight of his thoughts, yet unwavering in resolve. His tall frame seemed to exude an unshakable determination, a living embodiment of the promise he had just made to the world. Though the applause from the press conference had long since faded, its echoes lingered in his mind, a solemn reminder of the responsibility he now bore. He glanced back over his shoulder and saw his mother seated quietly in her wheelchair, her gaze steady and full of faith. That look wasn't just a reflection of her hope for him, it was a mirror of the silent plea from thousands, perhaps millions, like her. The forgotten, the dismissed, the mistreated. Anthony came to a halt and drew a deep breath. This airline could no longer be just a business. It had to become a symbol, a beacon of change, of compassion, and of justice. "This isn't just about protecting my mother," he reminded himself. "It's about standing up for the vulnerable, those society so often overlooks." Within him, the fire of resolve burned brighter. This wasn't only about holding Laura accountable, it was about overhauling an entire system that had allowed such indignities to persist. His mother's words, spoken with gentle truth and undeniable clarity, echoed in his mind.
There are so many others like me out there. I'll do what's right.
Anthony murmured to himself, his fists clenching as if to grasp the hopes of his mother and those who shared her struggles.
I won't let what she endured be in vain.
Outside the terminal, the world was already shifting. The video of Anthony's press conference had begun to circulate across social media, gaining momentum with every share. Hashtags like "Justice for Alma," "Airlines must be accountable," and "Respectful passengers" were trending, lighting a firestorm of public outrage. Comments poured in relentlessly.
Unbelievable that a major airline would let this happen. Anthony Rivers shows real leadership, but we need actions, not just words. Justice for Alma and everyone who has faced this kind of treatment.
The waves of anger from the public weren't just directed at Laura, they were aimed at an entire industry, demanding systemic change and holding up Alma's story as a rallying cry for justice. Anthony felt the weight of this rising tide pressing heavily on his shoulders, but he did not falter. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the future loomed with even greater challenges. He knew this was only the beginning. Returning to his mother, he saw the mingled pride and worry in her eyes. He knelt before her once again, taking her hand firmly in his.
Mom,
he said softly, his voice steady.
I won't let you down, I promise.
Outside the airport windows, the sky had turned dark, but the lights along the runways blazed brightly, defying the encroaching night. To Anthony, those lights were a reminder that no matter how deep the darkness, the glow of change could still shine through. And he knew that from this moment on, he was fighting not just for his mother, but for a world where every person, no matter who they were or where they came from, would be treated with respect and dignity. When the press conference ended, Anthony felt as though he had just emerged from a battlefield, but the relief was fleeting. Beside him, his mother, Alma, sat quietly in her wheelchair, offering him a gentle smile of reassurance, even as her body seemed to crumble under the weight of exhaustion. Anthony knew the fight for justice wasn't over. It would take more than public declarations to effect real change. What he didn't anticipate, however, was how deeply the wounds from that harrowing flight had begun to affect his beloved mother, not just emotionally, but physically. Now Alma sat motionless on the plush couch in Anthony's spacious living room, her gaze fixed on the view outside the window. His apartment was expansive, modern, flooded with natural light, yet she felt like a shadow, barely present in the bright, opulent space. The silk scarf she had brought from home rested neatly in her handbag on the table nearby, but she lacked the energy to take it out. Anthony sat across from her, his eyes never leaving her frail form. He couldn't ignore the signs etched into her face, the dark circles beneath her eyes, the pallor of her skin, the slight tremble in her hands as they clutched the edge of her cardigan. Despite it all, Alma smiled, as if trying to shield him from the pain that gripped her both inside and out.
I'm fine, Anthony,
she said softly, her voice fragile and thin, like a thread barely holding together.
Don't worry so much. A good night's rest, and I'll be as good as new.
Anthony didn't respond immediately. He stared into her eyes, those steadfast orbs that had always radiated resilience and grace. But now, he saw the cracks beneath the surface. Her strength was a facade, and he knew it. He had witnessed the way she struggled to rise from the wheelchair upon arriving home, her steps labored as though carrying the weight of the world. He had heard her muffled sighs, the ones she thought he hadn't noticed.
I know you're trying to be strong,
Anthony said, his voice low but tinged with an unmistakable urgency.
But you don't have to anymore. I'm here. You don't have to carry everything on your own.
Alma smiled faintly, her gaze soft but weary.
Anthony, I know you worry about me, but you have so much on your plate already. I don't want to be a burden.
Those words cut Anthony deeply, like a blade slicing through his heart. You've never been a burden, he wanted to shout, but instead, he reached out and gently took her hand in his.
You've never been a burden to me?
He said, his voice trembling with emotion but resolute.
All I want is for you to get better.
Alma nodded slowly, her smile still lingering but as delicate as a leaf trembling in the wind. Inside, her frail heart beat heavily, each thud a struggle, as if her body could no longer bear the weight of its own suffering. Yet she knew she couldn't let Anthony see that, not when his worry for her could pull him away from the work she so deeply believed in, the fight for justice she was so proud he had embraced. So Alma sat still, keeping the fragile smile on her face, quietly enduring the dull ache in her chest, a smoldering fire she didn't know how to extinguish. The next morning, Anthony's quiet home descended into chaos. When he stepped into his mother's room to invite her to breakfast, he found Alma lying on her side in the single bed, her face pale and lips tinged with blue. One hand clutched her chest, and her breathing was shallow and labored, each breath seeming like an immense struggle.
Mom,
Anthony cried out, rushing to her side. His trembling hand rested on her shoulder, his eyes wide with panic.
What's wrong? Say something.
Alma's eyes fluttered open, her cloudy gaze finding her son. She managed a faint smile, though it was weak and fragile.
I'm just a little short of breath,
she murmured, her voice as thin as dry leaves rustling in the wind. But Anthony knew it was far more than
just a little.
His heart raced wildly, fear clawing at his chest as he carefully lifted his mother into his arms, cradling her as if she were a child. Alma did not resist. Her body was limp and fragile in his grasp.
"Call an ambulance,"
he shouted to the housekeeper standing frozen at the door, his voice trembling with desperation. In the ambulance, Anthony held tightly to his mother's hand. He watched her through the oxygen mask the paramedics had placed over her face. Each shallow breath she took made the mask quiver slightly, a painful reminder of how tenuous her condition was.
"You're going to be okay,"
Anthony whispered, as if saying it aloud could make it true, as much for her as for himself. But deep inside, a growing fear gnawed at him. He couldn't bear the thought of losing his mother, the woman who had been the greatest inspiration of his life. When they arrived at the hospital, the medical team swiftly wheeled Alma into the emergency room. Anthony was left behind, his legs feeling like lead. Through the glass window, he saw doctors and nurses crowded around her bed, the harsh white lights above them cutting sharply into his eyes. Time stretched unbearably until a doctor emerged, his face grave.
"Mr. Rivers,"
the doctor called, his voice steady but heavy.
"Please tell me my mother will be all right."
Anthony said, stepping forward, his eyes filled with anguish. The doctor sighed, his expression tinged with sympathy.
"We've diagnosed your mother with acute heart failure,"
he said, each word hitting Anthony like a blow to the chest.
"Her condition is critical, and the primary cause appears to be prolonged stress. Her body can no longer cope with the physical and emotional strain."
Anthony stood frozen, the ground beneath him seeming to disappear.
"Stress?"
he repeated, his voice unsteady.
"You mean the flight? That's what did this to her?" "It wasn't just the flight,"
the doctor replied gently.
"For elderly patients like your mother, prolonged psychological stress can easily lead to conditions like this. But yes, the flight was likely a strong trigger."
Anthony's fists clenched as a surge of anger and helplessness swelled within him. He had believed he could protect his mother from every hardship, but now he realized that a lifetime of injustice and suffering had left its indelible mark. He followed the doctor into the hospital room, where Alma lay motionless, her small frame dwarfed by the sterile white bed. The tangle of IV lines and monitors surrounding her only made her appear more fragile. Anthony knelt beside her bed, his hand enveloping hers.
"Mom, I'm so sorry,"
he said, his voice cracking.
"I couldn't protect you. I let you endure too much pain."
Alma's eyes opened, meeting her son's. Though weak, her gaze was still filled with love and forgiveness.
"Anthony, don't blame yourself,"
she said softly, her voice as faint as a breath.
"Just promise me one thing. Don't let what I've been through stop you from doing what's right."
Her words etched themselves deeply into Anthony's heart, leaving a scar he knew he would carry forever. In the sterile white hospital room, the light from the window was dimmed by thick curtains, casting a soft yet cold ambience. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor beside the bed was a haunting reminder of how fragile every passing moment was. Alma lay on the small bed, her frail body almost swallowed by the white blanket, leaving only her gaunt face and bony hands resting gently on the sheet. Anthony sat beside her, leaning closer to his mother. He took her hand, once strong and steadfast, now weak and chillingly cold, making his chest tighten with grief. Her thin fingers twitched slightly, as if trying to squeeze the large, trembling hand of her son.
"Mom?"
Anthony's voice broke as he called out to her. His eyes were bloodshot, but he fought hard to keep the tears from falling.
"Do you know how much it hurts me to see you like this?"
Alma slowly opened her eyes, her gaze searching for her son's face. Despite her exhaustion, her eyes still held that familiar gentleness Anthony had known his entire life. She tried to smile, though it was as fragile as the last ray of sunlight at the end of the day.
"Anthony,"
she whispered, her voice faint, each word taking all the strength she had.
"you don't need to worry about me. I'll be fine." "Fine,"
Anthony repeated, his voice trembling with emotion.
"You always say that, but I know how much you've endured. You sacrificed everything, your whole life, so I could have mine, and I couldn't even protect you."
Alma shook her head slightly, her eyes filled with forgiveness.
"Anthony, you've done more than I ever could have dreamed. You are my greatest pride. Don't blame yourself for what you couldn't change. Life has never been fair, but what matters is that you never let it break you."
Anthony tightened his grip on her hand, his own hands shaking.
"Mom, I promise you, I won't let anyone go through what you've been through. I'll change everything. I'll make it right."
Alma nodded faintly, as if she understood that her son would dedicate his life to fulfilling that promise. Her eyes drifted shut, but she held on to her fragile smile.
"Anthony,"
she murmured, her voice as soft as a breath.
"don't let this stop you from doing what's right. You've always made me proud, and I know you always will."
Her final words were like a small flame in Anthony's heart, lighting his way through the darkness of despair. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against her hand, his shoulders shaking though he refused to let the sobs escape.
"You'll always be with me, Mom,"
he said, his voice breaking.
"I promise, I'll never let you down."
The heart monitor continued its steady beeping, but in that little room, time seemed to stand still. Anthony knew this was the last moment he would hear his mother's voice, the last moment he could feel the warmth of her touch. And he silently vowed that from this moment on, every choice he made would carry the strength of her love and her sacrifice. As his mother's final words echoed in the stillness, Anthony felt an invisible hand squeezing his heart. Each word Alma spoke was soft, yet they carried the immense weight of a lifetime of sacrifice and endurance. He fought to maintain his composure, but the rising tide of anguish surged within him, drowning his every rational thought. Anthony's large hands remained clasped tightly around his mother's frail ones. He could feel every delicate bone beneath her paper-thin skin, each a silent testament to the years of wear, not just from age, but from the burdens she had silently borne.
"How did I let this happen?"
Anthony questioned himself, his vision blurring with tears. He had once believed that with all he had achieved, he could give his mother the peaceful life she deserved. But what was the truth? It was the injustices she had endured her entire life, from the condescending glances of her youth to the outright disregard she faced on that flight, that had pushed her body to this breaking point. He gazed at her weary face, her gentle smile still present, as if she were the one trying to comfort him, even though she was the one in need of solace. Memories of his childhood flooded his mind, Alma tirelessly raising him alone under challenging circumstances, laboring day and night to make ends meet, all while enduring society's scornful gaze. The images played back like an old film reel in his mind, Alma standing steadfast at the schoolhouse door, shielding her students from the harsh sting of discrimination. Alma, hunched over her sewing late into the night, her calloused hands moving with tireless resolve. She had given up everything to provide him with an opportunity to rise above, yet in return, she had faced wounds he could never erase. Anthony clenched his jaw, a wave of helplessness washing over him. He had it all: power, wealth, the ability to influence the world, and yet he had failed to protect the one person who mattered most. He had failed. Not because he hadn't tried, but because he had been so consumed with pursuing grand ambitions that he had overlooked the quiet, relentless injuries that chipped away at her strength and time. Her voice lingered in his mind.
"You've always made me proud."
Those words cut deep, a dagger of both love and pain. Anthony realized that Alma, the strongest woman he had ever known, had spent her entire life shielding him from the injustices that had shaped her own existence. Now, when he had finally gained the power to shield her, time had robbed him of the chance.
These wounds didn't just take her health.
He thought, his eyes burning with a mixture of sorrow and determination.
They stole the peace she should have known in her final years.
He tightened his grip on her hand, as if trying to anchor himself to her dwindling presence.
I can't change the past,
he resolved.
but I won't let her leave this world without leaving a mark.
Anthony lowered his forehead to her hand, his tears falling silently as he let the crushing weight of his failure wash over him. In that quiet moment, he understood that Alma's suffering wasn't just her story. It was the story of countless others who had been marginalized, silenced, forced to endure because they had no choice.
She's not just my mother,
Anthony thought.
She's a symbol of everyone who has ever been forgotten, dismissed, or overlooked. And I, with everything I have, will not let her passing be in vain.
He clung tightly to her hand, as though that touch was the only tether keeping him from being swept away by the storm of his emotions.
Mom,
he whispered, his voice trembling but resolute.
I promise you, I won't let what you've endured be for nothing. I'll do everything in my power to change this system to make sure no one suffers like you did.
Alma didn't respond, but her lips curved faintly into a fragile smile, a farewell as delicate as her fading breath. Her eyes closed, carrying with them the peace she had earned after a lifetime of struggle and sacrifice. Anthony remained seated by her side, silent yet aflame with an unyielding determination. In that room, as the faint hum of the heart monitor filled the void, Anthony felt a fire ignite within him. He knew that from this moment forward, every action he took would carry Alma's legacy, a reminder that change, no matter how small, could begin with a heart willing to fight for justice and love. The hospital room was steeped in silence, punctuated only by the faint, mournful beeping of the heart monitor. Alma lay still on the bed, her eyes closed, her breath slow and delicate, like a candle flickering at its last. Despite the frailty of her small, fragile frame, an inexplicable strength radiated from her, a strength born of sacrifice and resilience. Anthony sat quietly beside her, his large hands holding her fragile ones as though anchoring her to him. He didn't weep aloud, but his shoulders trembled, as if bearing the weight of the world's sorrow. Deep inside, the ache of impending loss spread like a shadow, not only because he knew her time was short, but because he understood that the injustices she had faced throughout her life had stolen her health and her years. He gazed at his mother, the woman who had spent her entire existence loving, protecting, and sacrificing for him, and he knew that her legacy could not end here. Everything she had endured, all the pain and indignities, could not be forgotten. Each fragile breath Alma took seemed to whisper a reminder of everything she had done for Anthony. The endless nights she worked to put food on the table, the courage she summoned to shield him from the scornful eyes of a world steeped in prejudice. And now, her strength was waning. Alma's sacrifices were never just for Anthony, they were for a future she dreamed of, a world she hoped would be kinder, fairer, and more just. She had not lived to change the world, but she had planted the seed of hope in Anthony, believing that he would carry forward what she could not. Anthony bent forward, resting his forehead against her hand, as though trying to imprint her warmth onto his soul. His voice, low and choked, broke the silence.
Mom, you won't leave this world in vain. I promise you, everything will change. No one will endure what you've endured again.
Outside the window, the sunset was fading, surrendering to the encroaching darkness of night. Yet Anthony felt that within this shadow, a new fire would ignite, a fire of change, fueled by his mother's love and sacrifice. He raised his head, his tear-filled eyes burning with resolve. Tears streamed down his face, not just tears of grief, but of an oath, a promise from a heart now fully committed to those who needed him most. Anthony stood, feeling the weight of the legacy his mother had left behind. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he would walk it, step by step, guided by the strength she had instilled in him. In the stillness of the room, Anthony cast one last glance at his mother. Alma lay there, her face serene, as though she had completed her life's mission. And now, that mission had passed to Anthony. Outside, the night blanketed the sky, but lights from the city streets shimmered faintly, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, hope persists. Anthony left the room, his steps heavy with sorrow yet steady with newfound clarity. He would not fight solely for his mother, but for everyone who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or left defenseless. This journey, he knew, was not just about changing a system. It was about fulfilling the dream of the woman who had taught him how to love, how to endure, and how to stand unyielding for what was right. If Alma's story has touched you, please click share on this video to spread the message of kindness and fairness to more people. Anthony sat silently by the hospital bed, his hand still holding his mother's as if trying to capture every remaining moment. Alma's final words echoed in his mind.
Don't let this stop you from doing what's right.
But his heart felt impossibly heavy, burdened not only by the impending loss, but by the irrefutable truth the injustices his mother had endured throughout her life had left scars that could never heal, ultimately stealing her health and her life. A week later, as he stood before her portrait at the funeral, Anthony understood that his fight had grown beyond personal dreams. Alma's passing was not just his loss, it was a call to action for the world. It was a reminder that to correct the wrongs of a broken system, one must begin with compassion and accountability. That morning, the sky over Alma's hometown was veiled in a soft gray, as if nature itself mourned alongside them. Along the road leading to the small church where the service was held, hundreds walked in solemn silence, their heads bowed, carrying white bouquets in their hands. The old church, once the heart of the local community, was now overflowing with people. Wooden pews could no longer seat everyone, forcing many to stand against the walls or line the central aisle. The gentle hum of whispered conversations mingled with the faint sound of the organ playing in a corner, creating an atmosphere both somber and comforting. At the front of the room stood Alma's portrait on a modest altar surrounded by vibrant wreaths of white and yellow flowers. In the photo, Alma wore a gentle smile, her kind eyes seemingly piercing through to the souls of everyone present. But today, that smile only deepened the ache in their hearts. Members of the local community, from lifelong friends to the children Alma had once taught, had gathered to pay their respects. In another corner were passengers from that fateful flight, including May I Ling, Jack, and a few faces Alma had encountered only briefly. They had come not just to mourn, but to express their profound gratitude to the woman who had awakened their conscience through her quiet resilience. No one spoke loudly, but the exchanged glances carried unspoken understanding, as if all knew that Alma's passing was not merely the loss of one family, but a wound borne by the entire community. The flickering candles on the altar cast a fragile light, but the presence of hundreds of people served as an unshakable testament that Alma's love and legacy would never fade. Anthony stood silently at the front, near his mother's altar. His black suit was impeccably tailored, but it could not hide the weight on his shoulders or the redness in his eyes. Still, he did not bow his head. Today, he was not just a grieving son bidding farewell to his mother, he was the inheritor of her spiritual legacy, a man committed to fighting for justice, for fairness, and for the compassion that binds humanity together. Anthony ascended the podium slowly, standing beside his mother's portrait, framed by the soft glow of flickering candles. His face, a mixture of steadfast resolve and profound grief, was illuminated by the gentle golden light. In his hand, he held a small, slightly crumpled envelope, the letter his mother had written before she passed away. Below the podium, every pair of eyes was fixed on him. Alma's old friends, the children she once mentored, and even passengers from that fateful flight all sat in silence. The church was steeped in stillness, broken only by the faint whisper of wind brushing through the stained glass windows, carrying with it a strange, soothing serenity. Anthony took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the envelope and carefully unfolded the letter. His mother's handwriting, delicate yet unmistakably clear, brought a sharp pang to his chest. He glanced at the crowd, his eyes shimmering with tears, but when he began to speak, his voice, though heavy with sorrow, carried an undeniable warmth.
"My mother, Alma?"
He started, his voice resonating through the hushed space.
"Always believed in the power of kindness. No matter the hardships she faced, she reminded me time and again that even the smallest act of compassion could change a life."
He paused, glancing down at the letter, then continued.
"Before she passed, my mother left behind this letter. She didn't write about the pain or injustices she endured. Instead, she wanted to leave us all with a final message. I will read her words exactly as she wrote them."
Anthony raised the letter, his voice soft yet imbued with a quiet strength.
"Treat others the way you would want to be treated. Even the smallest act of kindness can save a life. I have lived through times when hatred, prejudice, and indifference could destroy a soul or even a person entirely. But I have also seen, even in the darkest moments, that the lights of compassion can shine and guide us. Never underestimate the power of a gentle word, a sympathetic glance, or a helping hand. The world won't change solely because of the powerful or the grand gestures, but because of us, each of us, when we choose kindness over apathy. This is the legacy I want to leave behind, not just for my son, but for all of you, people I have never met, but who have shared this journey of life with me."
Anthony's voice wavered as he reached the final lines, yet he maintained his steady tone, pouring every ounce of reverence and love into the reading. When he finished, silence enveloped the church. Faces in the crowd grew pensive, their eyes remained on Anthony, though it was clear they were reflecting inwardly, as if Alma's words had awakened something deep within them. Mei Ling, seated in the front row, clutched a tissue tightly, tears streaming down her face. Jack, the veteran, nodded solemnly, his gaze distant, as though reliving the moments Alma's resilience had touched his own life. At the back of the church, a woman stood apart, her presence subdued. It was Laura, the flight attendant whose actions had inflicted so much pain. Her pale face was streaked with tears, and as she heard the letter's final words, she bowed her head. Silent tears fell, an unspoken admission of guilt and a quiet plea for forgiveness. Anthony lowered the letter, his eyes brimming with emotion but burning with determination. He scanned the room, his voice firm as he spoke again.
"These words are not just my mother's final wishes. They are a call to action for all of us. Let kindness be her legacy. Let it be the light that guides us as we strive to change this world, one day, one step at a time."
The applause began slowly, from a small corner, then swelled and spread throughout the space. It was not merely a tribute to Alma, but an affirmation of the profound message she left behind, a message of kindness, empathy, and the immeasurable power of small, compassionate acts. The church seemed frozen in time after Anthony's final words. Alma's message, written in her delicate script, was more than ink on paper. It was a quiet whisper that pierced the souls of everyone present. The congregation, from Alma's lifelong friends to strangers drawn by her story, sat in silence. Each person appeared lost in their own thoughts, their eyes reflecting the weight of introspection, as if Alma's words had compelled them to confront their own hearts. Mei Ling bowed her head, tears streaming steadily down her face. Alma's words brought back the image of her on that flight, a small, fragile woman radiating unshakable resilience. Mei Ling couldn't help but wonder if she herself had been kind enough in her own life. Jack, the old veteran, sat upright, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the present. He seemed to be recalling comrades lost in battle or moments when he had chosen silence over action. Slowly he nodded, his heart swelling with respect for Alma, a woman he knew would have stood for justice had their paths crossed in the years of war. At the shadowed edge of the church, where the glow of the candles barely reached, Laura Spencer stood motionless, her hands clenched tightly, as if trying to contain the storm of emotion within her. She had come without expecting recognition, without daring to hope for forgiveness. Yet, as Alma's final words echoed through the sacred space, Laura felt as though each syllable was directed squarely at her. She remembered that day on the flight, the indifferent gestures, the cold, dismissive words she had spoken.
Treat others the way you want to be treated.
The phrase cut through her like a blade, leaving a wound she knew would never fully heal. Lowering her head, Laura let the tears fall freely. Shame coursed through her, raw and unrelenting. But within that shame, a faint glimmer of light emerged, a flicker of awakening. She thought that if Alma were alive, she might have forgiven her. But the greater question loomed: could Laura forgive herself? In the small, humble church, the mourners were no longer strangers. They were bound by an invisible thread, one of shared empathy and reflection. Each person silently asked themselves,
have I lived kindly enough? What can I do to become a small light in someone else's darkness?
The children Alma once taught, now adults, recalled her lessons about compassion and generosity. Her old friends remembered the moments she had stood up for them during their darkest hours. And the passengers from that fateful flight, Mei Ling, Jack, and others, felt the profound truth that patience and kindness could alter the course of a life. Outside, sunlight began breaking through the gray clouds, illuminating the white flowers that adorned the church steps. No one rushed to leave. The crowd lingered, steeped in a quiet transformation. Words were unnecessary, the change was happening within. From the podium, Anthony surveyed the somber faces before him. He didn't speak again, but his eyes conveyed gratitude and determination. Mother has planted a seed in each of their hearts, he thought. Now, it is up to us to nurture it, to let it grow and spread across the world. At the back of the room, Laura lifted her head and wiped away the last of her tears. She didn't know if her mistakes could ever truly be redeemed, but she understood she had to start somewhere with a small act, a genuine apology, and a sincere transformation of her heart. Alma's final words did more than close a chapter of her life. They opened a new chapter for everyone who had touched or been touched by her life. Anthony folded the letter carefully, his hands trembling slightly as he placed it on the altar beside his mother's photograph. Once more, he gazed at Alma's gentle smile captured in the frame, but this time, the emotions in his heart had shifted. Alongside the profound grief of losing her was an overwhelming sense of pride.
You were never just my mother,
he thought, his eyes reflecting admiration.
You were a beacon of hope for everyone you touched. And now, even though you're gone, the seeds of hope you planted will continue to grow.
A quiet determination began to light his heart, a resolve that felt like a gift passed down from his mother. Anthony believed her message wouldn't remain confined within the walls of this small church. It would echo far beyond, transcending time and space, reaching the hearts that most needed to hear it. Beneath the altar, the congregation sat in silent reflection. Yet, the atmosphere in the church had shifted. The weight of grief had given way to something deeper, an unspoken connection, a shared understanding that bound them all together. Mei Ling placed her hand over her heart, her eyes still red with tears, but now glimmering with hope. She felt an inexplicable bond with those around her, as though they were all entrusted with the same duty to carry Alma's message forward. Jack, the veteran, reached out to pat the shoulder of a friend standing nearby. His eyes conveyed a silent vow.
We can do this, we must.
The locals, the passengers from that fateful flight, and even those who had learned of Alma's story through Anthony, all felt a shift within themselves. Though they came from different places, with unique stories and lives, they were united by a newfound purpose, a movement to live better, to be kinder, and to spread the values Alma had championed. Anthony's gaze swept across the church, taking in the faces of both familiar friends and strangers, all of whom shared a common emotional thread. He realized his mother had accomplished something few could achieve. She had transformed hearts. Not through grand gestures, but through her daily acts of kindness, patience, and quiet strength. Taking a deep breath, Anthony felt the weight of his responsibility more heavily than ever before, but it was clearer now than it had ever been. He knew he was not alone in this fight. Outside the church, sunlight began to pierce through the gray clouds, illuminating the streets where people walked away with a renewed sense of connection and accountability to one another. Anthony's thoughts turned inward.
Mother, you always made me proud. Now, I'll do everything I can to ensure that what you believed in will forever change this world.
As the service came to an end, the crowd began to file out of the church, their steps slow and deliberate, as if they needed time to process all they had heard and felt. The soft murmurs gradually faded, leaving behind an extraordinary stillness that seemed to envelop the space. Mei Ling stepped through the worn wooden doors, a gentle breeze brushing through her hair, carrying with it a sense of both relief and contemplation. She turned back to look at the church once more, as if to etch this moment into her memory forever. Even a small act of kindness can save a life. The words echoed in her mind. Mei Ling understood that from this moment forward, she wasn't merely a witness but a part of something far greater. Jack made his way out of the pews with deliberate care, his weathered eyes shining with a renewed determination. He gave a slight nod to a stranger passing by, their gazes meeting in a silent understanding. Jack's thoughts turned to the things he could do, not grand gestures, but simple acts that he knew could still carry profound meaning. At the edge of the path, Laura stood motionless, her eyes still red from tears. She watched the departing crowd, her heart heavy with remorse, but flickering with a fragile hope.
I will change,
she whispered to herself, her hands clasping tightly.
Not just for Alma, but for myself as well.
Anthony stood on the church steps, watching as the attendees dispersed. The wind tugged gently at the white silk scarf he held, his mother's final gift for her granddaughter. A faint smile crossed his lips, though his heart swelled with emotion. His mother's message had planted seeds in everyone's heart, seeds of change, kindness, and responsibility for one another. Anthony understood that those seeds wouldn't sprout overnight, but he believed that, over time, through small acts, a better world would begin to take shape. The sky began to clear, sunlight breaking through the clouds and casting warm rays onto the narrow streets of the town. It felt like a quiet promise of brighter days ahead. Those who had attended Alma's funeral didn't just leave with memories of an extraordinary woman, they carried with them a responsibility to change themselves and the world around them. Anthony gazed into the distance, his heart brimming with resolve. He knew there was much to do, not only to honor his mother's legacy, but to help create the world she had dreamed of. And though the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, he knew he would not walk it alone. Every step taken away from that church would lead to acts of kindness. Every word Alma had spoken would continue to resonate, and every heart that had been touched by her story would become a beacon of light in the darkness. A profound transformation was unfolding, and it all began in this very moment. When the funeral ended, the departing footsteps carried away not just the weight of sorrow, but also the responsibility Alma had left behind. Her final message, delivered through the letter Anthony had read, resonated deeply with those present and began to ripple outward, far beyond the small church where she was laid to rest. On social media, videos of the funeral and Alma's last words were shared millions of times. The story of the small yet extraordinary woman grew into a symbol of kindness and the fight for justice. From her resting place, a new movement was taking root, nurtured by the love and sacrifice she had left behind. In just a few days after her funeral, Alma's story spread with a speed no one could have anticipated. The video from the flight, showing her being ignored and treated coldly, combined with the poignant words from her letter, became the focal point across social platforms. What began as scattered posts from funeral attendees quickly coalesced under the hashtag #RememberAlma, transforming into a rallying cry for communities to confront everyday injustices. Major media outlets couldn't ignore the wave of attention. Prominent publications like the New York Times The Guardian, and Le Monde ran features on Alma's life, heralding her as the woman who changed the world through kindness. Evening news programs aired footage of her funeral interwoven with clips from the flight, leaving millions of global viewers profoundly moved. On social platforms, thousands of individuals began sharing their own stories of discrimination and pledging to be kinder to those around them. A teacher in Tokyo wrote,
"I watched Alma's video and couldn't hold back tears. Starting today, I promise to treat my students with more fairness."
A doctor in Berlin shared,
"Her final words remind me that sometimes a little patience and empathy can save a life."
Discussions about discrimination and kindness began to surface, not just in personal posts but also in forums, conferences, and television programs. A global movement was taking shape, inspired by the quiet but extraordinary life of one woman. Alma's story was no longer just about pain and injustice. It became a testament to the transformative power of kindness. Her life was a spark, a small flame that had now ignited a worldwide blaze, lighting the path for change. In the weeks following his mother's funeral, Anthony sat in his office, his eyes fixed on a photograph of Alma smiling warmly, framed and placed carefully on his desk. Since her passing, his emotions had been a storm of grief and introspection, but gradually, the sorrow began to give way to a fierce determination. He knew his mother's story couldn't simply fade into shared posts and trending hashtags. He needed to do something bigger, something enduring to honor her legacy and ensure her beliefs continued to inspire generations to come.
"The Alma Foundation,"
he murmured, the name forming with an undeniable sense of purpose. It would be the means to transform pain into progress, to turn the lessons from his mother's life into a beacon for a better future. Anthony announced the launch of the Alma Foundation at a major press conference held at the headquarters of his airline. Standing before hundreds of journalists, his posture was resolute, his gaze alight with conviction.
"The Alma Foundation is established not only to honor my mother,"
Anthony declared,
"but to carry forward the journey she began, a journey of fighting for justice, dignity, and kindness."
He detailed the foundation's three primary goals: raising awareness about racial discrimination, fostering cultural harmony, and providing support to society's most vulnerable. He explained that a portion of his airline's profits would be allocated to fund the foundation. This wasn't just an act of redemption for a company that had failed to protect his mother, it was a commitment to genuine change.
"We will ensure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated,"
Anthony vowed,
"and that every passenger, regardless of race or circumstance, is treated with respect and dignity."
The response to the announcement was swift and overwhelming. The Alma Foundation garnered enthusiastic support from major human rights organizations around the globe. Amnesty International, the Anti-Defamation League, and the Nelson Mandela Foundation pledged financial and logistical support, recognizing the foundation's potential to go beyond advocacy and make tangible impacts. Initiatives included building multicultural schools, hosting educational seminars, and providing legal aid to victims of discrimination.
The Alma Foundation is not just a tribute to the past.
A United Nations representative said at the foundation's New York launch event,
"It is a guiding light for the future. We are honored to collaborate in bringing meaningful global."
What began as a deeply personal story quickly evolved into a global symbol of the fight against injustice. Anthony knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but as he looked at his mother's photograph, he found a wellspring of inspiration. "Mom, I won't let your story fade into obscurity," he thought. "I will show the world that even the smallest act of kindness can save a life, just as you believed." The Alma Foundation commenced its operations with a series of initiatives, from educational workshops on equality to financial support for marginalized communities. Backed by major organizations and propelled by Anthony's unwavering resolve, the Alma Foundation became more than an institution, it became a movement. A testament that kindness and justice could, indeed, reshape the world. From the birth of the Alma Foundation, a global movement against discrimination began to take root, spreading with remarkable speed. What was once Alma's private pain had transformed into a banner for a worldwide campaign advocating kindness and fairness in every corner of life. In schools, the Alma Foundation collaborated with local governments to introduce courses on equality and cultural harmony into the curriculum. In Chicago, a high school teacher recounted how, after implementing the foundation's materials, her students initiated their own discussions about discrimination.
We don't just need to accept differences.
One student declared during a school seminar,
We need to learn to respect and love one another for those differences.
In South Africa, an educational program on the history of racial discrimination, supported by the Alma Foundation, helped students grasp the lasting impact of social injustices. Stories like Alma's were integrated into lessons not just as historical accounts, but as living testimonies of courage and compassion. In Paris, an international conference titled Kindness Can Change the World drew thousands of attendees from over 50 countries. Speakers, including individuals who had suffered from discrimination, shared their stories inspired by Alma's message. A young activist from Brazil remarked,
I used to think I couldn't change the world, but hearing Alma's story, I realized change begins with us, with even the smallest.
Simultaneously, a global media campaign called Be Kind Like Alma was launched across social platforms. Short videos recounting Alma's story, paired with calls to action encouraging small acts of kindness, garnered millions of shares. Within a month, the hashtag became a top trend on Twitter and Instagram, connecting millions of people worldwide. The change went beyond awareness. In many places, new policies were enacted to ensure workplaces were free from discrimination. At a major corporation in London, a CEO addressed the entire company, stating,
Alma's story made me realize we need to do more to create an environment of fairness and respect. Starting today, every employee will undergo diversity and inclusion training so that we can not just be a company, but a family.
In the aviation industry, new regulations were introduced to improve how employees treated passengers, particularly the elderly and vulnerable groups. Some airlines even named their initiatives
The Alma Spirit,
reminding all staff of the importance of respect and empathy. The movement transcended borders, reaching the hearts of those who had once felt forgotten or undervalued. It became more than Alma's story, it became a reminder that anyone, anywhere, can be part of meaningful change. At an international press conference in Geneva, a representative from the Alma Foundation declared,
This movement isn't just about suffering, it's about hope. It reminds us that every act of kindness, no matter how small, can lead to monumental change. That is the legacy Alma has left us.
The candles lit by Alma's story had grown into a blazing torch, illuminating the path toward a fairer, more harmonious world. That day, golden sunlight streamed across the plaza of the newly renovated International Airport. Amidst the bustling modernity stood a small bronze statue of Alma Johnson, gleaming atop a pedestal of polished marble. Alma, her gentle figure captured with a serene smile, seemed to be welcoming travelers from all over the world. Anthony stood before the statue, his hand lightly brushing the inscription etched carefully into the pedestal.
A small life that changed the world.
Reading those words, his heart tightened, a blend of pride and profound emotion washing over him. Each word seemed to encapsulate his mother's life, a life marked by struggle and injustice, yet radiant with resilience and boundless love. He lifted his gaze to the statue, his eyes lingering on the bronze face that so perfectly captured her compassion.
Mom,
he whispered, his voice tinged with sorrow but steady.
You always said you were just an ordinary person, but you taught me, and now the world, that is the most ordinary people who can make the biggest difference.
Memories flooded Anthony's mind, his mother shielding her students from discrimination, tirelessly working day and night to put him through school, and her frail yet smiling face as she lay on her hospital bed, urging him to always do what was right. He drew a deep breath, his chest swelling with determination. Her legacy would not stop here. Around Anthony, a crowd had gathered to witness this solemn moment. Mei Ling, the young passenger who had supported Alma on that fateful flight, stood in the front row. She gently wiped away a tear as she looked up at the statue.
She didn't just change my life,
Mei Ling thought.
She changed the way I see the world.
Jack, the veteran, stood quietly off to the side, his weathered eyes tracing every detail of the statue.
What she stood for,
he reflected,
will forever remind us that kindness is the strongest weapon against injustice.
Other passengers from that pivotal flight, along with supporters of the Alma Foundation from across the globe, shared a profound connection. Though strangers before, they now felt united by a common belief that Alma's story would continue to light the way forward. A gentle breeze swept through the plaza, rustling the flags of many nations flying high above the airport. A moment of silence enveloped the gathering as everyone bowed their heads before the statue. They were not only honoring a woman who had passed, but also paying tribute to the values she left behind: kindness, the fight for justice, and the belief that every individual holds the power to effect change, no matter how small. Anthony stood tall, his shoulders no longer burdened by the weight of grief. Instead, he felt a sense of peace, as though the statue affirmed that his mother's spirit lived on in the hearts of millions. Turning to Mei Ling, Jack, and the others, their eyes met in a shared understanding and unspoken resolve. As sunlight glinted off the statue, the inscription on the pedestal seemed to glow, its message shining brighter than ever.
No matter who you are, no matter where you come from, you can make a difference. Alma did, and now it's your turn. Click shares to help turn Alma's legacy into real action. Together, we can create a better world.
As the crowd gradually dispersed, the small bronze statue of Alma Johnson stood silently in the bustling plaza of the airport, a quiet yet steadfast sentinel. The inscription on the marble pedestal, Alma Johnson, a small life that changed the world, continued to draw the eyes of passing travelers. A few paused, reading the words, and left with a quiet smile, as though touched by a profound reminder. From a distance, Anthony watched strangers pause before the statue. Each carried their own story, their own journey, yet all left with a different expression, as if a small flame had been kindled within them. He knew his mother's legacy was not confined to this statue or the Alma Foundation he had created. It lived on in every heart that had been moved, in every act of kindness carried into the world. Elsewhere in the airport, a young employee bent down to help an elderly traveler retrieve a fallen suitcase, offering a warm smile. On a departing flight, a flight attendant gently handed a cup of water to an elderly woman, accompanied by a thoughtful inquiry about her comfort. These small, fleeting gestures bore the unmistakable mark of Alma's story, a tale of an ordinary woman who had inspired extraordinary change. Anthony smiled, his expression a mix of serenity and resolve. He understood now that his mother had left behind not only a legacy for him, but a timeless lesson for the world that great change begins with seemingly small acts. Alma's legacy would not end. It would continue through the Alma Foundation, through educational initiatives, media campaigns, and the retelling of her story from one generation to the next. But most importantly, it would endure through the everyday kindness of countless individuals. Outside the airport, the setting sun bathed the statue in a warm golden light, like a promise from the past reaching into the future. A small life that changed the world. And now the world would continue to change through those whom Alma had touched.